So now it's panel 3, student loans. We will be hearing from Dan Collier first. He's going to talk to us about balancing acts, how remaining payments and loan balances shape well-being in public service and loan forgiveness.
Well, as I look for my presentation, I will say the last time I had a 5-minute presentation, it went so terribly. My wife let me stop in Knoxville to get a supercharger for the Subaru. So either one of two things is going to happen. This is going to be really fun, and you guys are going to learn some things, or it's going to go really badly, and I get a supercharger for the Caprice. Just don't tell her. Okay. Let's put that up there, right? Where are you at? There we go, timer. So, first thing I want to do is thank you all for inviting me here. I'm a higher education researcher that focuses on policy, and hanging out with mostly sociologists seems pretty fun. I don't normally get to do that. It's usually economists and public policy people, so thanks. I also want to give a shout out to the Student Borrower Protection Center who funded this first round of research. I have another round of funding coming, but I can't say who's funding it. They have been an extraordinarily awesome partner, and if you're doing student loan debt research, hook up with them. They are great to be thought partners with, but they are out of the research. They do not tell me how to do my research. They do not influence my research. I get to do whatever I want. So that's just a great partner right there. So one of the things I want to talk about is public service loan forgiveness. It's been a hot topic as of late, and I think the Biden administration just said that they have forgiven now 1 million people in public service loan forgiveness. Most recent updates on the website were from June 2023, and that was about 680,000 people. So it's great. Forgiveness is actually happening for people now. It's not completely fixed, but it's on that way, and that's a great thing. There's been systemic issues with the program. Incorrect counts. That's the same for IDR as well. Jobs not qualifying. There's a great paper, mixed methods paper by Miller called The Magical Thinking of Public Service Loan Forgiveness, where at the time only a couple hundred people had forgiveness, and they were like, so what do you think about forgiveness from the people that wanted it? And they were like, well, we hope it happens. That's not good policy, right? That's not what the law says. You're not supposed to hope that happens. That's supposed to happen for you. So noting some of these issues, there's been 2 different kinds of systemic changes for temporary public service loan forgiveness, and there needs to be more, but at least this is a great start over the couple of years. So core questions of my research, this part of my research are balances and remaining payments separate concepts in the minds of borrowers? That's something that somebody at AEFP asked me when I was presenting other information, and the answer was, we don't really know because people never really got to forgiveness. So we don't know what that means to them. They just have this thing that exists. And how are balances and remaining payments related to financial distress and subjective well-being? Psychological distress, suicidal ideation, stuff like that. So I also used mixed methods methodology. I ran a survey, had about 2,600 people, American Federation of Teachers, Student Borrower Protection Center, unions for social workers, schools, and the federal employees all chipped in to help us get this sample, and we're going to be expanding this as we move on in this other year. We also conducted 124 interviews for about 60 minutes. Obviously, we didn't ask them one question, and we talked about it for 60 minutes. We had a really robust conversation that multiple papers are coming out, and a bunch of my students are working on these things too. So what I wanted to employ was a structural equation model. I'm not going to get deep into the stats here, but the model's acceptable, the model works, and it's not optimal, but it's within that acceptable range. And so what I want to focus on are the orange pieces. Federal loan balance being its own concept and remaining payments being its own concept. Federal loan balances in this model go up by $20,000, right? So you start at 50, then the next bin is 75, stuff like that. Remaining payments go down every year in this model. Like, it would be useless to say if a payment goes down by 1 month, what effect does that have on you? Because the borrowers in interview were just like, that doesn't mean anything to me. The year, 1 minute. All right. So the outcomes are balances go up, distress goes up. Repayments go down, distress goes down. Makes sense, right? Balances are subjected to negative amortization, or they're not making progress. People try to forget these balances, but these balances either stay where they're at or they go up on people. They don't go up by $20,000 on people all the time, but there are some people with higher balances where they do jump that. So either that is static or it goes up. And then people really tried focusing on remaining payments. They get within 1 year of forgiveness, and that really becomes a spike down for their distress. They're like, yes, I'm right there. I can see that. So one thing to consider if you're going to work with this, and one thing that we're finding that Tay et al. In the Journal of Happiness suggested is maybe financial distress or stress is the gateway for these financial variables to subjective well-being, and we're finding that. And so real quickly, one last point. These financial variables do not link directly to subjective well-being. They're passed through financial distress. And that is something to consider when doing this kind of work. Now, different concepts, different policies here. We can talk about that if you have questions. And then our next thing we're looking at is suicidal ideation, which interacts with how many payments you have remaining, but more importantly, psychological distress, as you can see here. That's it.
Okay, next we have Fenaba Addo, who is going to talk to us about Black borrowers, student debt, and the value of post-secondary education.
Can I close this? Is that okay? Okay, let's put mine on top. All right. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Fenaba Addo. I'm a associate professor in the Department of Public Policy at UNC Chapel Hill. So in my brief time before you, I'm just going to do a kind of like a key points from the work that I do in this area. And then if you have questions, we can talk about it later. So I have 4 major takeaways. One is that, as we probably know, as everyone in the room probably knows, Black borrowers accumulate more debt and take longer to repay it. The second is that Black-white student loan debt disparities are linked to Black-white wealth inequality, and eliminating these debt disparities could potentially decrease racial wealth inequality. Third, in newer work that I've been doing, I argue that income is insufficient to assess the returns to a post-secondary education, and that a wealth-based metric to define middle-class status highlights persistent inequality. And in addition, it unmasks the economic fragility of college-educated Black young adults. And the kind of fourth slight addendum is that these trends are disproportionately burdened by Black women and their families who attend post-secondary education. So I'm going to talk about those 4 points very briefly. So Black student borrowers take on a disproportionate amount of student loan debt to attend and complete their undergraduate education. So some recent figures we have is in 2016, 85% of Black graduates across all higher education institutions types graduated with debt compared to just under 70% of their white peers. These trends tend to hold independent of the types of institutions attended, degree completion status, and their socioeconomic background. Racial gaps in parental wealth mean that Black students accumulate more debt and are taking longer to repay their outstanding balances. So evidence from older millennial young adults indicated that Black young adults owe more 10 years after college than the average white student did when they left college, and that more than a third of Black borrowers ever defaulted on their loans, compared with 20% of Latino, 12% of white, and 6.5% of Asian borrowers. We also know that default rates for Black borrowers also exceeded white borrowers, independent of whether they completed their studies. We also know that racial gaps are largest among college-educated populations. So the typical Black household with a college degree has about 17 cents for every dollar of wealth for the typical white household with a college degree. And the typical Black household with a master's, professional, or doctorate degree has about 20 cents for every dollar of wealth held by the typical white household with the same degree status. So it is estimated that if total student debt cancellation was enacted, I don't know if you see my thread here, I am kind of an advocate for student debt cancellation, eliminating these debt disparities, the racial wealth gap among older millennials who ever attended a post-secondary institution would decline by approximately about 10%, or 10.4, which is approximately about $4,500. Let's see. So kind of getting to kind of my newer arguments, higher education credentials have become this defining characteristic of social mobility and is associated with achieving an income-based defined middle-class status. However, when we rely on earnings to define the economic value of post-secondary education, I find that this is incomplete in an era of widespread student debt, wealth inequality, and the necessity of higher education. An earnings-based, human capital-centered narrative kind of mask broader social and broader structural and economic factors that shape educational attainment and mobility, and has failed to account, like I said, for the role of student debt and this is disproportionate burden on Black students and their families. So what do? I use a wealth-based definition to define middle-class status, which I believe is critical for kind of understanding social mobility today. And again, it helps to normalize education debt accumulation, and it incorporates this new economic reality beyond labor market returns. Am I doing okay on time? Okay, so let me jump. Always do that, always run out of time. Okay, what I find is that at all education levels, Black young adults are less likely to be middle class relative to white young adults at similar education levels, and this difference widens as educational attainment increases throughout young adulthood. In other words, white students have higher chances of being middle class at every education level. I also want to end with saying there are gender differences in student debt. They're large, and this gender gap grows at 1.2%. And we find that these trends or these patterns are exacerbated when we look within race, and in particular among Black borrowers who attend post-secondary education. And if you have more questions, you can ask me in the Q&A. Thanks.
This will let us go back in. All right, cool. Okay, awesome. All right, next we have Joan Mazelis, who's going to present I Definitely Feel Like I'm Moving Backward, Student Loans and Residential Independence After Graduation. Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to take more than 5 minutes, but it's still going to be under 6.5. And I was told that there's a little grace period. So thank you to Arielle and CCF. Good morning. So this work is part of a larger study with my collaborator, coincidentally, Arielle Kuperberg, exploring the role of student loan debt and the transition to adulthood. Today I'm going to share some findings on residential experiences of participants after college graduation. So we interviewed students and graduates at 2 public universities. I'm going to focus just on the qualitative interviews with those with loans today. We started by interviewing 24 graduating seniors in spring 2016. Details on the sample are here. 20 participants completed at least 1 follow-up wave, 15 completed at least 5 waves, and 12 participants completed all 7 waves of interviews over almost 8 years. 1 participant died between waves 6 and 7. Residential independence is one marker of the transition to adulthood. Living independently can create a sense of having arrived in adulthood, but it can also be so expensive that it can be elusive even for people who earn a reasonable salary. A monthly student loan bill makes it far more difficult. People who lived with their parents in our sample described their living arrangements in complicated ways. They recognized financial benefits, but also sometimes felt the burdens of reciprocity or tensions in their relationships. Jennifer Smith lived with her boyfriend and his parents after college graduation, which put her on firmer footing in the long run. Jennifer and her boyfriend each provided $100 a month to his parents when they moved in after college. His parents did not require this. Rather, it made her feel better to contribute even what she saw as a token amount. She said, "If I had to afford an apartment, I don't know how I'd do it, because I quite honestly would have run out of money after month 2. I don't know how I would have done any of it." Living virtually rent-free allowed them to build savings and plan comfortably for a future as homeowners, a goal they achieved together 3 years after college graduation. I'm going to skip Leo. PJ Kapoor had completely paid off his $20,000 student loan debt by wave 3 because, as he said, literally every paycheck I would get, I would just throw it into my loans. At wave 3, PJ explained how their arrangement had worked. He lived with his parents, and he told us once per year, I'll just give my dad a one-time payment. It's usually around $6,000 or $7,000 per year, which worked out to about $500 a month. For PJ and for Leo, delaying residential independence didn't just cut down on costs, it also positioned them better for loan repayment. I'm going to skip Ashley also. Noah Poole was living with his parents at waves 2 through 5. Noah told us that his decision to live at home and pay his parents varying amounts over the years, as much as several $100s each month, but also sometimes much less, was just the smartest thing financially. He explained, my parents told me, stay at home and just, pay off your student loans. He said, the fact that I can contribute, it just feels more like a partnership. He was confident he would be in a better financial position when he did move out because his reduced housing costs were allowing him to save. At later waves, Noah had moved out to live independently from his parents with his brother and another roommate. So Jennifer, Ashley, Noah, and PJ were able to live with their parents rent-free, but they provided financial support to their parents in some ways as well. But the financial contributions participants gave amounted to a lot less money than they would have had to pay for housing if they were living independently. Living with parents helped graduates with loans, but it was complicated. At wave 2, Monique Lewis had just moved back in with her mom and told us, I feel like I lost everything. Like everything just got ripped out from under me. I definitely feel like I'm moving backwards. At wave 3, Monique and her romantic partner were both living with her mom and each contributing around $300 a month. But her mom let it slide when money was tight. Monique also did a lot around the house, especially caring for her younger siblings. Sometimes it felt overwhelming. As she explained, I'm cooking dinner, I'm getting kids home from school and giving baths and getting them to bed. I take them to school in the morning, I get them dressed, I'm doing a lot. Monique felt like the arrangement was still working well, even when her contributions felt weighty, and she felt she did a lot around the house because she hadn't always been able to contribute financially. At wave 4, still living there, she said that she felt like she shouldn't be living with her mom after college. Monique explained that part of feeling like an adult came from residential independence. And she said, when you're past a certain age, you're supposed to be out on your own. And she said, she busts in my room all the time. She never knocks. Or when she's like, did you do your chores? Like, yes, Mom, I did my chores. Don't call it that. Just her saying, did you do your chores, just makes me feel like a child. At waves 5 and 6, Monique and her partner were still living at her mom's house, but they finally moved out to their own rented apartment just before our wave 7 interview in 2024. Sometimes living with parents threatened participants' sense of independence, and sometimes the financial or household help participants provided to their families in return for a place to stay felt burdensome. Yet even in these cases, participants generally concluded that overall living with family members was the right decision. So, conclusions. We found living with parents made a big difference for participants in limiting expenses, and clearly for PJ and Leo and their debt repayment. When participants contributed to household expenses, it still served as a financial advantage because the amounts were minimal compared to independent living costs. Sharing housing helps graduates with loans, but it delays the transition to adulthood if we measure that transition as living independently. Research participants felt that in some ways, living with their parents kept them from crossing a threshold to adulthood, yet it positioned graduates better for loan repayment, a major obstacle in reaching financial stability, and another marker of the transition to adulthood. So sometimes achieving one means not achieving the other or not as quickly. Some participants who live with their parents felt doing so kept them from feeling like adults, and at the same time, living with parents allowed their transitions to adulthood to be more stable and lasting. Along with residential and financial independence, completing education is also a marker of adulthood. But when a college degree is accompanied by substantial debt, the financial independence that can represent adulthood may remain elusive. Increasing public spending on higher education would reduce student loan debt and could facilitate college graduates' transitions to adulthood characterized by a more durable financial independence. And so it's no surprise that I also am in favor of cancellation. I'm definitely an advocate for that. So thank you so much.
All right, and finally, we have the impact of the student debt payment pause and its end on families. Arielle Kuperberg.
All right. So today I'm going to talk about the impact of the student debt payment pause, which I'll explain what that is in a minute, and the end of the pause and how it affected families. So a little bit about student debt in the United States. Almost 2/3 of adults have attended college, and about a little over a third of U.S. adults have completed a college degree. About 2/3 of college graduates, who we focus on in this project, this is part of the same project with Joan Mazelis, take out loans averaging over $35,000 at graduation. So this chart is from NLSY data that we analyzed, and we found that among adults born 1980 through 1984, fewer than 10% managed to both finish a college degree and not take out loans. About 40% of all adults ended up with loans, and some of those graduated. Many of those do not graduate and are in an even worse off position. In our project, we focus on graduates. So the COVID loan pause, during the start of COVID, the administration paused student loan payments during this time. Payments were paused for, and this is public student loans, not private student loans, but most people have public student loans. Private loans are more rare. I think it's about 17% of our sample had private loans. So loan payments were frozen, interest did not accrue from March 2020 through September 2023, and about a year ago, October 2023, they resumed student loan payments. In our study, which I'll talk more about in a minute, we found that 81% of people in our study who had taken out loans were affected by the loan pause. The remainder had pretty much mostly paid off their loans, or there were a few who had paid off their public loans but still had private loans. Most of those people stopped paying on their loans during the pause. So about 80% stopped paying entirely. Another 13% kept paying on their loans but paid less than they typically would pay. Only 3% continued to pay the typical amount of loans, and 3% paid more than they would typically pay, taking advantage of the interest pause to pay down their principal. So our data, we have a mixed methods project with Joan Mazelis that we've been working on for like 11 years now or something. And it has many pieces to it, but the part I'm going to focus on today is a survey we collected in December 2023 from graduates of 2 public regional universities, and these are 2017 and 2021 graduates. They're 2 cohorts that we've been following since they were undergrads and surveying them after graduation to see how do student loans affect their life. Of those, so we ended up with 295 responses to this survey, and 219 of them had taken out student loans, 189 still had debt to pay off, and 186 were directly affected by the loan pause. So I'm going to focus on responses from those people. And another important thing to note is that 25% of our graduates had children by December 2023. So the questions I'm going to focus on today, we asked, when you weren't spending money on payments for your public or private loans during the loan freeze, what did you use the money for? Some of them also, by the way, some of them also had their private loans paused. That's why we worded it this way. How did you change your spending habits when you started making loan payments or larger loan payments earlier this fall as a result of your student loan payment? And imagine that 1 year from now, Congress decides to forgive everybody's student debt. The law is passed. You suddenly have $0 in student debt. What would you do differently? So, and I'm going to focus on the responses related to families. We asked a whole bunch of different things, but I'm focusing on families today. So what did you use frozen loan money for? About 3% said they had used it for a wedding, 1% had used it to pay for a divorce, and 9% spent the money on a romantic partner, which could enhance romantic relationships. 6% used it on expenses related to having additional children. 1% used it for infertility treatments specifically. If you had children, about 38% said they used their student loan payments to spend money on their children, and 5% helped a family member by giving them money. When loan payments resumed, how did spending change? A little over 1 in 10 had to borrow money from family in order to make their student loan payments. 19% of parents said they took their children out of extracurricular activities or didn't sign them up for activities they would normally do. And 8% said they moved home with their parents. And finally, what would you do differently if loans were canceled? 13% said they would get married sooner. Similar amounts said they would have children sooner or have additional children. 18% would save up for their kids' tuition, and this included some people who didn't have kids yet. 33% of people who did have kids said they would save up for their kids' tuition, and 11% said they would move out of their parents' home. So in conclusion, student loans seem to be restricting family formation, housing independence. The pause enabled some people to make family transitions. These numbers were low, but the gap between people with and without student loans is not huge. It's about 8% in fertility rates. Like, it brings down your fertility by about 8%, but that translates to we calculated like over 800,000 children who have not been born because of student loans. And the loan pause also enabled spending on romantic partner, kids, and other families, while the end of the loan pause had intergenerational effects affecting both the parents of people with loans when their kids moved back in with them or borrowed money from them, and their kids who experienced like restriction in their activities. And thank you to my research assistants, to Joan, Mazelis, and to the NSF.
If our speakers will come up, we'll have a Q&A for 10 minutes.
Hello. So I think you all kind of spoke very directly to the fact that this is going to have long-lasting negative impacts on individuals, disproportionately Black and brown people. What are the larger society, in the context of certain narratives being pushed up, we want you to have kids, we want you to, you're restricting your ability to have bodily autonomy to do so. What are some of the larger implications you're seeing or could think of in the future that are going to have on this family structure, but also as a society that is not producing children or happy life outcomes and independence because of loan repayments?
I can go. So we've done some other research showing it is impacting fertility rates. So first of all, generally your income goes up when you have a college degree, whether or not you have loans, although it goes up a little bit less if you have loans versus like people with loans also end up with lower income. But the family returns are kind of more complicated, where now it's gotten to the point where people who have a college degree but have loans have lower fertility rates by the time, like our data goes through when they're in their 40s, compared to people who have some college degree and don't complete a college education. Although people who don't go to college still have the lowest fertility rates. So yeah, you want to think about like the alternatives. The alternative could be they graduate college with loans. The alternative could also be they don't go to college at all or they graduate college without loans, or the other alternative could be they don't go to college or they don't graduate, and like having less education also leads to lower income, which like hurts these outcomes as well. But I do think, so as we try to calculate, a reporter asked me this once, it's over 800,000 kids among it was like 20 to 40 somethings. We tried to use census numbers to figure out how many people in their 20s, like the prime time that people have children, are having fewer kids because of this. And we've seen a lot of rhetoric and now legal changes that are like, oh God, we're not gonna have enough kids. So as a demographer, I can tell you, there's all sorts of implications if we have an aging population, because there's like, basically we're now below replacement level fertility, where people are not having enough kids to replace the current generation. And that means that there's like, now the population is gonna get older. The Social Security system depends on younger workers paying into it so that older workers can take that money out. If there's fewer people with, paying into the system, that's going to lead to like not enough money. And that's another thing that like we see people in society talking about, how Social Security is going to run out of money, and maybe sooner, we could raise taxes too. But I think it has like these deep, and now I think panic over the falling fertility rate has definitely played into the fall of Roe versus Wade. So Yeah, I think it's bad. Like,
In a nutshell.
in a nutshell, I do think by focusing on some of these other family outcomes, maybe we could like change the narrative a little bit about why it is important to have to enable people to go to college without taking out student loan debt, and that like a lot of the rhetoric is like, oh, they borrowed money, they should pay it back, and like, what's the big problem? So they have to live with their parents. But it is tied to these broader issues in society that people do care about. So I think like making that connection so that politicians think of that connection can be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I also have to say that I think that, like, as Fenaba mentioned, right, like student debt cancellation, and I would also say, like, and lowering costs of college for moving forward as well, is pro-racial equality, right? And it helps mitigate class inequality and the kind of economic difficulties. But that doesn't resonate in the same way, right? It doesn't. I mean, the economic stuff, people are like, well, you're talking about taxes, I don't care. Like, they just glaze over. But if it's like these people who are supposedly pro-child and pro-family, well, then student debt forgiveness is pro-family policy, right? If it's going to get people to get married and have kids. And the truth is, like, I think that there's a lot of ways in which we struggled a lot with, are these the same markers we should be looking for, right? Like, do people want to get married and have kids? Not everyone wants to do that. It's heterosexist, it's heteronormative, right? But it is actually what the people that we've talked to said they want, right? They're still talking about, like, they want to buy a house with a white picket fence, and they want to have 2.4 kids, and want to live in the suburbs, and send their kids to a good school. They want all of those same things, and so shouldn't they have access to those things? And so it's not just about fairness and justice and equality and all of that, but it's also about, like, if we're worried about future generations and not having enough children, then we should make it easier to go to college and not have debt, and people will continue to have kids.
So one thing I wanted to talk about was not having the kids, but what happens to people who have kids already and opportunities that exist. Like during the pause, I have work that shows that mimics similar stuff here in that parents were spending money on their children. They were giving them things like guitar lessons, and I want to share real quickly a follow-up email of what happened with the pause from one of my participants. Hi Dan, I wanted to follow up with you after your interview last fall. We talked about one of the questions you asked about what happens when payment restarts. I'm paraphrasing some of this. I surmised things like guitar lessons for my daughter would be off the table. That turned out to be true. Her guitar lessons and my student loan payment were about even. I tried to make it, but I had an unexpected overdraft, and we have to cancel those. Again, longer email, but that's what it is. So when we think of like the birth rate, we think of having multiple children, not just the one, right? Why would you have multiple children if you can't give the one child the opportunities you want that child to have with something as simple as like guitar lessons, right? So we have that back end issue as well, and we know, at least my work shows that in the pause, people made the choice to have more children, and I don't know if we're seeing that out in the data significantly different, right? But maybe we see some upswings in it. But some people that already had children decided, maybe we can do this one more. And they knew they were going to have to repay the student loans were going to be turned back on, but they were hoping they would be in a better situation, and a lot of them are not. So.
I was recently assigned a project at work that required me to read the ACE, Race and Ethnicity in Higher Education 2024 Status Report, and in the section about borrowing and grant aid, they didn't put them side by side necessarily, but I was sort of struck by how these sort of borrowing and granting systems work in tandem because there are similar disparities. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was the disparities, the racial and ethnic disparities in institutional grant aid. And I know we talked a lot about like public policy and federal aid, but what do you all see as the role of education institutions in addressing this problem?
That's a great question. There's a lot to that question. If we look by institutional sector, we know that institutions such as HBCUs, MSIs, have been underfunded by states. There's a lot of great reporting on this area, especially within my home state of North Carolina. With like North Carolina A&T, just vastly underfunded. But these also be the schools that are just where we see serving minority students or students of color. those students who go there take on more student loans, so there's like this direct kind of pipeline of the institution being underfunded, students going there, having to take on more federal student loans, coming out with more debt. It's all connected, right? And then, why is this under? I think there's a great case in Tennessee with like the University of Tennessee and Tennessee State. I think it's, or maybe these their names of the institutions
You're right.
mixed up, right? Okay, thank you. Where we see the similar kind of happening. One was in which we see well, it's not
Way underfunded.
way underfunded.
Intentionally. So.
Intentionally, right? Intentionally. So yeah, it's kind of the like what known unknown thing that has recently kind of happened. The U.S. history with respect to race and public policy, federal policy, and like structural issues that we see how they've kind of perpetuated this inequality.
So can I just say, some institutions though are trying. I mean, it's a zero-sum game. They don't have that much funding to begin with to do it. But one of the institutions that we studied piloted a program starting in fall 2016, where based on your adjusted family income, you would qualify for either waiving of tuition, all tuition, or part of tuition after application of other grants and scholarships. And it's a minority serving institution, and it did increase enrollment among people who wouldn't have gone to college had it not been for that. And it did reduce their student loan debt. But of course, like, that meant that college got less tuition revenue over time, right? And so there's a question about whether that can continue, because people don't necessarily want to invest in that.
And I think, and I guess I'll say, yes, we see more innovation coming, on the horizon, but a lot of these trends happened, for decades prior. So we have, we're dealing with adults who are carrying significant, based on decisions that were made, decades ago. So where we saw most of kind of the innovative financial aid happening were in private institutions, but you have to be lucky enough to get into a private institution, which are highly selective. And so, that's what I'm saying. This is a very heavy topic. Yeah, exactly.
So real quickly before real quickly, two papers that might interest you. One is by Douglas Weber about overall state appropriations being limited, therefore loans go up. The other one is by Brendan Campbell and Barrett Taylor, looking at racial makeup of an institution and people that come from it and why they would get more money if they were more white.
Yeah, I was just going to add that we, one of the universities in our program had a 10% budget cut from the state during the Great Recession, and then a 15% budget cut 2 years later. And then we found tuition went up by about 70% over the next 5 years. So there is, most people do attend public colleges, and there is a direct pipeline between states cutting budgets or not expanding budgets as much as they should be, given rising demand for higher education. And I know there's a study that found that states and the federal government used to cover 70% of costs of public higher ed, and now it's less than 50%. So that gap is falling. It's being made up by loans. I do think we may be reaching a limit where some schools are we can't raise tuition anymore. It's too much, and people aren't going to come here anymore. And I think the public conversation around student debt has also led people to be more hesitant to take out student debt. But yeah, there's a lot of private institutions that have these forgiveness programs. But
okay. One question. She was so patient. And I cut her off.
And maybe I can turn it into a comment. I don't understand, and I'm wondering if there's research out there about why there isn't sort of a mass movement among parents who are paying a lot of the costs of higher ed, right? But then are also managing on the back end when their children come home. And I find it very odd or troubling, and I'm among them. I benefited from state investment in public higher education, right? And now I'm paying, for my kids to go to school, and it's such a huge burden. And I'm just kind of where is the collective consciousness and the movement among parents to mobilize and demand, a reinvestment in, particularly in public higher education. But I understand I live in.
Okay, can I answer in 5 seconds? Sure. Okay, so part of what you're describing though is you're really in an elite group, right? So like the parents of the people in our study did not pay for their college. They did not get financial help for tuition with their college education. They did not. Their parents couldn't afford it. And that's part of why they let them live at home, because they couldn't give them other kinds of help. But that doesn't mean you're not, I mean, certainly you're not alone, right? There's lots of people who do that. I think, though, that you're asking people who are basically upper class to develop some class consciousness and to push back on it. And I don't think you're going to get as many people as you want to join in with that, because it's not working class. That's not what the working class are experiencing.
Yeah, I just
So one group real quickly that the other political, and I'll start with that. All right. One group that is a consistent feature in like what think about the truckers, right? And my whole thing, I push back on that bullshit, honestly, because the truckers, right? They have children that went to school. About 40% of truckers went to college of some sort. They have student loan debt. But then you have the idea of what a blue-collar worker does, right? And then it's that intersection between wanting my kid to struggle a little bit like I did, and then also like I don't want to see them harmed. So we got to find the parents that are in the liminal zone, that are those kinds of people that get pandered to in the larger work. But they're struggling with their own identities, and that's why you don't see that come out as well as you would see like our class of people. Sorry.
Okay, let's give them a round of applause.
You got to get skin in the game.
All right, panel four. Panel four, immigration and families. I'm Sarah Shoppy-Sullivan from Ohio State University, and also the president of the Council on Contemporary Families. And I'm going to be the evil timekeeping person for this session. So first we have Bethany Latique speaking about Central American immigrant families still waiting on Washington, interlinking policy